aspect of history is how it can help to explain how current events came to be, or at least give us an understanding of how they came to be. One thing happening in the world right now is the crisis in Niger. Last month, there was a coup d'etat in the region, and the commander of the Presidential Guard, General Abdurrahman Tchiani, declared himself as the leader of a military junta that is running the nation. This situation resulted in the Economic Community of West African States giving a week for the leaders of the coup to hand back the presidency to the elected president, Mohamed Bazoum. Now there is talk of military intervention from Nigeria, Benin, Senegal, and the Ivory Coast to restore the leadership to Bazoum. Meanwhile, the nations of Burkina Faso and Mali, which are both currently under the leadership of juntas themselves, are vowing to intervene on behalf of the Nigerian junta if an invasion happens. So, how did this all come to be? Like many nations in Africa, the borders of Niger came about after decolonization. Niger was a French colony up until 1960, when they gained their full independence. The area that is now Niger was an economic crossroads for many of the indigenous empires of the region for centuries. This included the Songhai, Mali, Gao, and Kanem-Bornu. There was also the nomadic Tuareg who lived in the area, who frequently clashed with the various empires of the region and sided with the house estates of the region as well. During the scramble for Africa in the late 19th century, France conquered swaths of land and administered them from the Senegal colony, which had special privileges within the French Republic. The conquered areas were often administered by various military officers. Then, in the late 1890s, a single governor from Senegal was put in charge of all of the territories, and he reported directly to the French Minister of Overseas Affairs. And by 1904, the territories under French control were formally called French West Africa. A lot of things about France were implemented and put into effect. One of those, the abolition of slavery, which happened in 1905. This would see over 1 million slaves move back to their original homes after emancipation. The French would retain control of the region through the first decades of the 20th century, up until the Second World War, when the authorities of West Africa declared they would be loyal to the Vichy regime. They would stay under control of the Vichy regime until November of 1942, when the Allied landings in North Africa happened. After the war, France started to offer more and more political rights to their colonies around the world, including those in Africa. There were even 10 seats allocated to representatives from French West Africa for the Assembly to help create the new constitution of France after World War II. 5 of those were to be elected by French citizens and 5 elected by African subjects. In all, 6 Africans were elected to represent the region for the Assembly, with 4 white people that were elected. Now, as a result of the constitution that was created, which established the Fourth French Republic, limited citizenship was granted to the natives of the African colonies in 1946. Each territory would elect local representatives, which had consultative powers, and they approved local budgets. Then universal suffrage was introduced in 1956, and territorial elections would elect vice presidents of governing councils, and they would serve under French colonial governors who were named with president of each colony, including Niger. In 1958, the new constitution of the Fifth French Republic shook things up even more, with the colonies becoming a protectorate of France, with a national assembly named for each colony. The assembly would elect the head of government, who would advise the head of state, which was still a high commissioner appointed by the French government in Paris. A further change to the constitution in 1960 would make it easier for French protectorates around the world to declare independence. And so this would begin to happen in 1960. Now, the process would actually begin a few years earlier than that for Niger. They started with elections on December 4th, 1958, and the questions put forward in the elections were twofold: on whether to remain part of the French community, a modified form of the French Union which would allow for limited self-government with a path to independence, and then to elect members of the National Assembly. The election would result in Niger declaring itself a republic within the French community on December 18, 1958. However, seeds were already being sown at the time of infighting and division. The Mouvement Socialiste Africain, called Sawaba in the Hausa language, would call for a no vote in the referendum about becoming a member of the French community. They lost that vote in 1958. And then in 1959, the French government banned all political parties in Niger except for the governing party, the Nigerien Progressive Party. The supporters and leaders of Sawaba fled in exile, and in 1960, when the nation gained full independence, Hamani Diori would be elected the first president. Diori would lean on the links to France in the early years of independence and kept many of the existing social structures, which were partly borrowed from France. The single-party system would see Diori re-elected in 1965 and again in 1970, unopposed. There was also some economic development thanks to uranium mining, and the education system was expanded. Diori's image in the West would see him become a spokesman for African affairs, as well as being called upon to help arbitrate disputes between African nations during the decolonization period. At home, though, the administration was incredibly corrupt. Diori would be called out for neglecting many domestic issues, including the Sahelian drought. There was a coup attempt in 1963, which was stomped out, and an assassination attempt in 1965, and those were linked back to Sawaba. There were also student and union protests in the handling of domestic situations, and Diori actually called upon France to help put those movements down. Ethnic tensions also contributed to many of the issues in Niger. The government was made up of those from the Jerma, Songhai, and Maori ethnic groups, and I do apologize if I mispronounced any of those. These were the same ones that the French actually looked to for help with colonial rule during the colonial period. The Hausa, who made up over 40% of the population of Niger, were never part of the government in the early years of the nation. There were accusations of the misappropriation of aid coming to the country during the drought, and Diori didn't help his image domestically. He proceeded to limit government appointments to those who came from the same ethnic group as himself, the Jerma, as well as friends and family. He also declared himself the Minister of Foreign Affairs and the Minister of Defense. This all came to a head in April of 1974. A coup d'etat was launched by Lieutenant Colonel Sani Kunche, and Diori would be imprisoned until 1980 and would stay under house arrest until his death in 1989. The new military government would help bring about a period of some prosperity, but it wasn't that great of a living. They didn't allow any expression that went against them. There were arbitrary imprisonments and executions. This would be the rule of the land from 1974 until 1993, when the next presidential election was held. In 1987, a new leader came to power that helped to pave the way for these elections. A national conference was called in 1990 to help draft a new constitution, and a transitional government would be put in place in 1991 to lead the way to those elections. The transitional period wasn't the greatest economically for the nation, but it did help create a guide for the future. There were several free and fair elections that didn't end in violence. There was freedom of the press that was exercised. Things were looking up for Niger. In the 1993 elections, the Democratic and Social Convention would win the presidential election, and Mahaman Ousmane was president. This was done with the support of other parties through a coalition, but within 18 months, that coalition collapsed. The legislature was dissolved, and there were new legislative elections. In these elections, the National Movement for the Development of Society won most of the seats, and Hama Amadou, the party leader, was named prime minister. Now, while all of this was happening, there was a lot of unrest in Niger that they were trying to deal with. The military was fighting the Tuareg rebellions. Now, by 1995, the government had worked to create peace accords with these groups, and they were absorbed into civilian life and into the military, and this was all done with the assistance of France. But aside from that, the government was essentially paralyzed, as Ousmane and Amadou were continually clashing and weren't able to get anything done because of that difference politically between the head of state and the legislature. Now, with nothing able to get done, eventually somebody took things into their own hands. Colonel Ibrahim Ber Mainasara would overthrow the government, deposing the first ever democratically elected leader of Niger on January 27, 1996. He would lead a military junta through a 6-month transition, appointing a group to draft a new constitution, and presidential elections were organized for June of 1996. It honestly looked like things were looking up. And there were 4 other candidates during this election. Mainasara was running, as well as Ousmane. However, partway through the election, the electoral committee was dissolved by Mainasara, and another one was created before the counting of the votes was completed. And as a result, Manasara would win the election with more than 50% of the votes cast. Now, as a result of how he came into power and the fact that it was a rather questionable circumstances to winning the election, many countries stopped economic assistance for Niger. And they were kind of justified, as civil liberties would be repeatedly violated, as would basic human rights. Opposition leaders to the government were imprisoned or outright killed. Journalists, whether domestic or foreign, would be beaten, and the foreign ones would be deported. Nobody wanted to get the word out as to what was happening. And this all culminated in 1999 with the assassination of Manasara by Major Daouda Malam Wanke. He would put a transitional reconciliation council in place that was tasked with drafting a new constitution, something that had happened just a few years earlier. Now, international observers were welcomed into the country to overwatch this referendum for the new constitution, and they declared it free and fair. Then legislative and presidential elections were held in October and November of 1999. The new president was Tanja Mamadou, who won the election, and the nation was back under civilian rule by December of 1999. This in itself is something that doesn't always happen when there is a military coup d'etat, where control is actually handed back to civilians, but this happened in Niger in 1999. Now, the next step, thanks to the new constitutions that were created, was in 2004. Municipal elections were held across the country, and this was kind of the start of a decentralization process, taking a lot of the power away from the main government. The event saw 3,700 people elected to new local governments, and there were 265 newly formed communes. Now, the MNSD, we'll go back here, we'll jump back. MNSD was the same unit, or same party behind Hama Amadou, the National Movement for the Development of Society. They actually won the majority of the seats across the country throughout those newly formed communes. And there were also some gains by some of the opposition parties as well. So by December of 2004, Niger conducted presidential and legislative elections after the success of those municipal elections. Mamadou Tanja won his second 5-year presidential term, and he got 65% of the vote. And the international observers again said this election was pretty much free and fair. And this was the first time a democratically elected incumbent in a presidential election was re-elected. And now this was really testing Niger's democracy to make sure that everything was good. And really, it was a pretty solid base. And in 2004, a coalition supporting Tanja secured 88 out of the 113 seats in the National Assembly. Now, just 3 years later, a snag. The second Tuareg insurgency in Niger. This was started by a previously unknown group called the Mouvement de Nigerien pour la Justice, mainly composed of Tuareg members. They presented demands related to development in the north. They started attacks on military facilities. They started to lay landmines, and there was a lot of negative impacts on investment in Niger, as well as tourism to Niger. Negotiations and peace deals would come about, and then by 2009, things would be culminated in a ceasefire and an amnesty. Now, this period from 2009 to 2010 is considered to be the sixth Republic of Niger, with Mamadou Tanja as the president. But political tensions started to grow when Tanja tried to extend his presidency beyond the constitutional limits through a proposed Sixth Republic. He dissolved parliament, and then a political struggle unfolded, and ultimately Tanja would be imprisoned on corruption charges following a military takeover. Now, the military again promised to restore democratic rule, and this actually happened through another constitutional referendum and national elections. Mahamadou Issoufou of the Nigerien Party for Democracy and Socialism emerged as president after the 2011 elections. And this survived a coup attempt in 2021, which happened just before the inauguration of the current president, Mohamed Bazoum. Bazoum would be sworn in 2021, but then he was ousted for office just this past July in a coup d'etat, and a National Council for the Safeguard of the Homeland was declared. And a lot of the power dynamics have changed. There's been numerous international declarations since, and that brings us to kind of the situation where we stand now. So that's a quick summary of Nigerian history from colonization to today. So how does the history of Niger bring us to what's happening in that nation now? And it does all go back to one key thing: colonization. The decolonization process that helped to end colonization had a noble aim in the eyes of the European lawmakers. They were restoring self-governance and ending the exploitation of these territories. However, it brought about a whole set of problems of their own. Throughout the colonial periods, you would have artificial borders drawn up by diplomats, ambassadors, and more in Europe. And these would disregard ethnic, cultural, and linguistic divisions. During the colonial period, this really wouldn't matter, since the party in power was the European colonizer, in this case, France. Once France was out and the government of Niger was made up entirely by locals, well, those locals would strive to ensure they would be able to get into power and hold it over those who they historically had issue with, who were not in power. Conflicts within the borders of the nations that gained independence, such as Niger, would be due to power struggles amongst these groups. And it didn't help that colonial rule also helped exacerbate many of these divisions, with France often favoring one group over the other, which helped to create this resentment, and this resentment boils over, and it continues to boil over. Decolonization also created a vacuum of institutions. There was no education system that was left in place. There were no administrative structures left, no governance mechanisms, nothing. It left these nations with having to try to build things from the ground up, or they would have to rely on their former colonial power. Economically, this was a disaster as well, with no ability to create a diversified economy. Instead, with the example of Niger, France was able to help steer the economy by exerting influence. And this was apparent at many times, with France essentially outlawing all but one party in the political structures just before full independence, and then making it so that uranium mining was one of the key drivers of the economy. Thing is that this would be uranium that was mined in Niger and purchased by France at prices that were set by France as opposed to the open market. Then artificial borders and weak institutions, ethnic divisions, forced economic dependency, external interference, and these internal power struggles have led not one, but 5 attempts at a constitution in Niger. Now the future of the nation rests in the hands of a military junta there, and they have a few choices ahead of them: to remain in power for the simple purpose of being in power, or stepping down and allowing the former president to return to power. Again, the world's eyes are watching as you have many of these nations that were part of French West Africa, that were decolonized by France in 1960, that are undergoing some of these struggles. Burkina Faso, Chad, Mali, many of these nations are encountering these issues, all going back to how the colonization process went. And much of it is tied to, believe it or not, the Treaty of Berlin, or the Berlin Conference. And we'll take a look at that next time, as we try to understand what's happening when it comes to the situation in Niger, which has many, many nations in Africa starting to rattle the sabers ahead of a possible military conflict. We hoped you enjoyed this video as much as we enjoyed creating it for you. If you found the content valuable, here's a quick favor we'd like to ask. First, give this video a big thumbs up and hit that like button. Your likes not only show appreciation for our hard work, but it also helps this video reach more people who might benefit from it. Secondly, if you haven't already, make sure to hit that subscribe button and turn on the notification bell. By subscribing, you'll be the first to know whenever we release new content, ensuring you never miss out on any exciting updates. Also, don't forget to follow us on our social media channels to stay connected beyond YouTube. We love engaging with our community and sharing additional content, behind-the-scenes glimpses, and updates on what's coming up next. And lastly, if you want to take your support to the next level and help us continue creating quality videos, consider joining our Patreon community By becoming a patron, you'll gain access to exclusive perks and be an integral part of shaping the future of this channel. We genuinely appreciate your support, and it's because of viewers like you that we can keep producing content we're passionate about. So thank you once again for being a part of this journey. Remember to like, subscribe, follow us on social media, and check out our Patreon if you can. Until next time, take care, and we'll see you in the next video.